Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The American Slave Coast by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're on chapter 34, which is called Wake Up Rich. And it starts with a quote from a Southern patriot written in Charleston on July 29th, 1835. Incendiary tracts and papers. The mail brought by the steam packet Columbia, arriving this morning, has come not merely laden with, but literally overburdened with, the newspaper called The Emancipator, and two tracts entitled The Anti-Slavery Record and The Slave's Friend, detained for circulation all over, destined for circulation all over the southern and western country. If the General Post Office is not at liberty to act in this manner, it is impossible to answer for the security of the mail in this part of the country, which contains such poisonous and inflammatory matter. So, what they're saying is that the Emancipator, which was a abolitionist newspaper, was inflammatory to their way of life, and they didn't want it being shared amongst their enslaved population, nor the people in the area that were just common folk. Even to speak of slavery, much less criticize it, was likely to excite the affections of Southern congressmen. The South erected an informational firewall so that the alternate reality could not be disturbed. The censorship of mail in the South was general. Ideologically suspect literature was routinely confiscated. People in the South could only rely on Southern sources to tell them of the supposed horrors that the abolitionists were planning for them. District Attorney Francis Scott Key ran Benjamin Lundy out of Washington City in 1833 for having printed an article in the Genius Universal Emancipator that said, "There is neither mercy nor justice for colored people in the District of Columbia." More than half of the Black people in Washington were free, and Key, one of the most prominent deportationists, was still district attorney in Washington 2 years later in August of 1835, when a white mob ran riot for 2 whole nights and destroyed Black schools, Black churches, and Black homes. A sensational pamphlet that described a plan for the Christmas Day slave uprising throughout the South created a panic in central Mississippi during the hot summer of 1835. It was widely believed that a criminal named John Morrell had a huge gang and planned to incite a massive slave rebellion to facilitate plundering the towns. Morrell, a murderous highwayman and notorious kidnapper of slaves, was serving 10 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary at the time for Negro stealing, but that didn't stop the rumors. Many Mississippians were led to believe that the state was indeed threatened with the fate of Santo Domingo, writes Edwin Arthur Miles. In fact, there was no uprising and no white people were killed by Black people, but respected citizens formed extra legal vigilante groups that extracted confessions and lynched dozens of white men, 5 of them gamblers, and an unknown number of Black people. Similar groups hunted gamblers or other transients in towns and settlements up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. So, as you can see, there was a lot of paranoia, and they were even killing their own because of their paranoia about slave uprisings. 1835 was the summer of abolition propaganda. when a mail campaign by the American Anti Slavery Society sent tens of thousands of Garrison published pamphlets down south via the postal system. They have raised funds and support to circulate inflammatory newspapers and pamphlets gratuitously, wrote John Quincy Adams. And they send multitudes of them into the southern country in the midst of a swarm of slaves, which is causing great excitement and fermentation in all parts of the Union. Many Southern newspapers carried alarmed reports of the arrival of sheaves of abolitionist literature at the local post office. Charleston postmaster Alfred Huger wrote to his counterpart in New York post office that the most respectable of all parties gathered about our doors and windows, and in a little time I was formally summoned to give up the incendiary publications, which were known to be in my possession, and at the same time told with very little ceremony that they would be taken from me if I did not. I could only resolve that when the mail became the object of attack, I would make it the object of defense. But seeing plainly the excitement and exasperation which every moment increasing, I came to the determination to separate the obnoxious papers from the rest of the mail, not doubting that otherwise the whole of the mail might be destroyed between the office and the railroad. Postmaster and key Jackson advisor Amos Kendall approved. In a letter to Huger that was published in various newspapers, he wrote, "We owe an obligation to the laws, but a higher one to the communities in which we live. And if the former be perverted to destroy the latter, it is patriotism to disregard them." Francis Scott Key would not be outdone in rooting out terrorism, saying, "Are you willing, gentlemen, to abandon your country, to permit it to be taken from you, and to be occupied by abolitionists, according to those whose taste it is to associate with the amalgamate and amalgamate with the Negro?" He shouted in 1836. It was part of his sensational prosecution of the youngest doctor, Reuben Crandall, for having possessed a trunk full of copies of The Liberator and the Anti Slavery Reporter in his home in Georgetown. So you couldn't even have this material in your home. They were so incited and upset by it. Key kept Crandall in jail for months because remember, he was the DA in that area. And though Crandall was found not guilty, he contracted tuberculosis in prison and died 2 years later. Key remained district attorney until the Whigs moved into the White House in 1841, using his position to suppress abolitionism wherever he found it. Nor was the hostility only in slavery territory. In Boston, William Lloyd Garrison was nearly lynched after being captured by a mob that came to attack a meeting of the Boston Female Anti Slavery Society. Abolitionist meetings were broken up by mobs in New York where there was much Southern sympathy. So you see, everywhere they go, what they're telling you is that they would kill white people. They would unalive white people, excuse me, in order to uphold slavery. Meanwhile, traders continued trafficking young African Americans southward. On his first trip south in 1835, William Henry Seward saw a disturbing sight in Virginia, as summarized by his brother and biographer, Frederick W. Seward, who said, "A cloud of dust was seen slowly coming down the road from which proceeded a confused noise of moaning, weeping, and shouting. Presently reaching the gate of the stable yard, it disclosed itself. 10 naked little boys between 6 and 12 years old, tied together 2 by 2 by their wrists, were fastened to a long rope and followed by a tall, gaunt white man who, with his long lash, whipped up the sad and weary little procession, drove it to the horse trough to drink, and then to the shed, where they lay down on the ground and sobbed and moaned themselves to sleep. These were children gathered up at different plantations by the trader, and when the driven and then were driven down to Richmond to be sold at auction and taken south. In New Hampshire, the young Jacksonian Franklin Pierce, a protege of Levi Woody, was appalled by the formation of an anti slavery society in his home state in 1835. He wrote to a friend, "One thing must be perfectly apparent to every intelligent man. This abolition movement must be crushed, or there is an end to the Union." And he was writing from New Hampshire, the New England states. James Madison died in 1835, leaving the legal ownership of his slaves to his wife Dolly. His writings bear witness that he had repeatedly agonized about the wrongness of slavery, though not as much as his slaves must have agonized about it. Madison did not leave Dolly in a good financial condition, and the Panic of 1837 exacerbated her problems. It was a typical Southern widow's situation. Dolly Madison's slaves were her nest egg because remember, they kept their money or their mass of investments in the slaves because slaves held the value. And despite language in Madison's will forbidding her to sell them without their consent, she sold them off to pay her ne'er do well son's debts. Montpelier itself was sold to a Richmond merchant in 1844. Along with the explosion of abolitionist propaganda in the 1830s came a new kind of argument, one championed by an emerging generation of free Black abolitionists whose focus was on the degradation forced on the enslaved. Frederick Douglass expressed it in his 4th of July speech in 1852 in Rochester, New York. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and the crimes against God and man must be denounced. Douglass was so radical that he called for a full political rights of women. A nascent American women's rights movement drew energy from women's activity in the anti slavery movement. Their largest participation in American politics up to that time. Often denied membership in men's political organizations, and without the right to vote, they formed ladies' political clubs, collecting signatures for the petitions that John Quincy Adams laid on the table by the hundreds in the House of Representatives. Now remember, it wasn't that all women couldn't vote, and it wasn't that all men could vote. However, you had to be propertied to vote, and obtaining the franchise or earning the right to vote was something that had to be extended first to poor white men and then to women, white women. The coffles marching through the nation's capital became the number one target of the anti slavery movement. The District of Columbia was Congress's responsibility, so grassroots organizations, local clubs, flooded both houses of Congress with petitions to close the slave trade in the federal capital. The term slave breeding became part of the anti slavery polemic. The interstate slave trade, the visible symbol of slavery. In response to John Quincy Adams' continued presentation of abolition petitions, Speaker of the House James K. Polk in 1836 cut him off with a gag rule requiring that nothing relating to the subject of slavery could be introduced or discussed. The gag rule, which was reinstated every year with even more restrictive language until 1844, became a cause celebre for anti slavery movements. Adams, outraged, focused on breaking it, exposing himself to censure for receiving and submitting petitions. The more petitions he laid on the table, the more came in. By the 1837 to 1838 term, there were 130,200 petitions calling for the end of slavery in the District of Columbia. Others called for abolition nationally, for abolishing the interstate slave trade, for lifting the gag rule, against the annexation of Texas, against dueling, and during the winter of 1838 to 1839, more than 200 petitions for the recognition of Haiti, which was the busy trading partner of U.S. merchants while officially remaining a pariah country. So here they're talking about the fact that they wanted to profit off of Haiti. They wanted the benefit of knowing Haiti, but they didn't want the responsibility of being associated with Haiti, the world's first Black nation. The arrival of master race Jacksonian democracy, the eruption of abolitionism as a movement, and the radicalization of the nullification movement combined to make new, unapologetic attitude toward slavery that was felt especially along the southwestern frontier. In Mississippi, which had grown from 26 counties in 1832 to 55 counties in 1836 as former Choctaw and Chickasaw lands became occupied. Sergeant S. Prentice, the newly elected to the Mississippi House of Representatives in 1836, introduced a resolution that the people of the state would look upon the institution of slavery as it exists among them, not as a curse, but as a blessing, as the legitimate condition of the African race, and that they hope to transmit this institution to their posterity as the best part of their inheritance. We will allow no present change or hope of future alteration in this matter. So remember, Sergeant S. Prentice wanted slavery to be forever. In the decade between 1830 and 1840, as the plantation system exploded into the newly available lands, Mississippi's free population increased by a factor of 2.54 up to 180,440 free people of color, where only 1,366 of them. But the enslaved population almost tripled to 195,211. Mississippi now had a Black majority. In Mississippi, as in Carolina, there was no doubt, at least among the slaveholders, that God himself was pro-slavery. "I am a nullifier," shouted South Carolina's Robert Barnell Rhett in 1837 in his first major speech as a congressman. Having surprisingly outed himself as a Calhounian, with the declaration that Rhett's speech pivoted into another kind of discourse as he unwound into an over the top hyperbole. Rhett, who had no military experience, romanticized war, enter the warmongers, and even annihilation in the service of the glorious cause of state sovereignty over the federal government, which was the case of South Carolina, was to say, in service of slavery. He extolled martyrdom, which he had no intention of personally experiencing. He gave the House its sharpest taste yet of the belligerent, self apotheosizing oratory of the new generation. After shouting chains of rhetorical questions, Rhett spoke defiantly of the resistance that he insisted would have met Jackson had Jackson invaded South Carolina during the nullification crisis, saying, "Had South Carolina been invaded, upon the first gleam of the bayonet along our mountain passes, he would have seen and known that the chivalry of the South really was not the bloodless tropes and metaphors, but in the stern realities of a tented field. Not only Carolinians, but thousands of volunteers from the whole South, whose names were upon the file, would have met you in the fierce contest." And he goes on talking about how brave these men of the South were. He also says, "We knew the mighty inheritance for which we were to contend, that soil over which for 2 centuries we had been the lords of, and whose altars at which our fathers knelt, and we had received our brides. We won it by the sword and were prepared to keep it by the sword." Rhett had taken his political stage name just before running for office. Following a fashion in South Carolina to rename oneself after one's most illustrious ancestors, Robert Barnwell Smith and all his brothers changed their common laborers' last names to the more romantic sounding Rhett. It was a Gaelic style spelling, Rhett, of the name of a matrilineal ancestor, a Dutchman named Raed, Raedt, whose claim to fame was having captured Stede Bonnet, Charleston's only pirate of note. So he was leaning back into a matrilineal line to assert his family's ancestry, and he brought that forward. So there's nothing wrong with matrilineally focused bloodlines. They just tell you that there's something wrong with it in an attempt to brainwash you. Think about it. Margaret Mitchell took 2 of the Low Country's best known pro slavery political names for her fictional character of Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. But Robert Barnwell Rhett was no Clark Gable. Balding on top by his 30s, he tried to disguise it with a comb over, his red face framed by a high-topped starched collar. There is little favorable commentary about him. He was ambitious, arrogant, belligerent, and an implacable foe with a martyr complex who attacked no one as ferociously as those who were almost agreed with him. His biographer, William C. Davis, speculates that there might have been favorable commentary about him in documents that were destroyed when Charleston fell, and concedes that it is something of a struggle at present to present a balanced portrait of the man, especially since out of his own mouth he so often offends. Rhett was a self-righteous, utterly convinced of the righteousness and rightness of slavery, and declares with careless truth that we would add to, again, quoting Davis, the inability to follow others and the compulsion to enforce his own will, his unwillingness or inability to countenance any ideas but his own, and his constant scheming. He was aggressively religious, having had a kind of born again experience while remaining within the Episcopal fold. Rhett's view of history was decidedly odd and self serving, believing, as he did, that Charles Pinckney and not Madison was the real father of the Constitution. One might be forgiven for thinking that Rhett, barking mad, but that is an insufficient explanation for the phenomenon he presented. He was arguably the single most influential individual in pushing the South to secession. He referred to himself as Lucifer, a matchstick that lit the blaze. Rhett had been a force in the nullification movement and played an active, if complicated, role in Calhoun's increasing radicalization. Under his former name of Robert Barnwell Smith, he had for years been pushing Calhoun to the right from his position in the South Carolina General Assembly, a powerful body that chose the state's governor, senators, and representatives. Rhett was from Beaufort, a wealthy town by the site of the former Huguenot settlement in Charlesfort and Spanish Santa Elena, in the heart of the region that produced long staple or Sea Island cotton. At Beaufort College in South Carolina, the aristocratic young planters flatly rejected the notion of the age of reason and believed fully in the natural right of the oligarchy. That sentence is telling you how they educate the elites in schools. Okay? That is telling you how they educate the elites in schools, and they still do this to this very day. That's why it's important to not just pay attention to the Harvards and the Yales, but you have to pay attention to the Ave Marias and what schools these people are sending their children to and what classes are they taking, because they're being trained in rulership. Chancellor Williams also talks about taking some of these classes at Oxford and at, no, not Oxford, excuse me, in England. He talks about taking some of these classes. And he discusses the fact that these classes were specifically being offered to those that were of the white class to teach them how to rule as colonial masters. Beaufort was ground zero for secessionism. The succession house in that town, owned in the 1850s by Brother Edmund Rhett, was a central meeting place for secession apostles who became known as the Fire Eaters. By the time Rhett arrived in Congress, he had not merely declared in 1829 that I am a disunionist, I am a traitor. In the wake of the Force Act, he proposed what might lie beyond succession, a confederacy. He was the prophet of the independent slave nation, commanded from South Carolina. In what was perhaps a veiled dig at the most infamous and famous Jacksonian poet, Rhett declaimed that the States' Rights and Free Trade Party Convention of 1833, that the Star Spangled Banner no longer waves in triumph and glory for me. Sir, if a confederacy of the Southern states could now be obtained, should we not deem it a happy termination, happy beyond expectation, of our long struggle for our rights against oppression? Rhett and his clan built the most powerful political clique in Charleston. Any serious politician needed a newspaper, and Rhett's brother in law, John A. Stewart, owned the Charleston Mercury, the most radical paper in the South. The family also came to control the Columbia South Carolinian in the state's capital. There were Rhett brothers. There were Rhett brothers in the state legislature, and they had control of the Bank of South Carolina. Ironically, Rhett was a distant cousin of John Quincy Adams. When they were much younger, the two had met in private life. Describing Rhett's congressional speech, Adams dryly noted his recent name change, saying, Robert Barnwell Rhett, Smith heretofore, moved a long amendment and literally howled a nullification speech. I say howled, for his enunciation was so rapid, inarticulate, and vociferous that his head hung back as he spoke, with his face upward like a howling dog. In 1838 speech before Congress, Rhett explained his economic theory of the superiority of slavery. According to him, slaves were better off than free laborers because they were both capital and labor, and self interest would mandate their better treatment. In the midst of his lengthy lecture of political economy, he said, there is but one state of society in the world where labor and capital are incidental in interests, and that is where domestic slavery exists. Labor, there is capital, and capital is labor. According to Rhett, that was the that was what South Carolina was fighting for, with God's full approval, for labor to be capital. Of course, that meant there had to be a capital market. Rhett owned over 100 slaves whom he had brought pursuant to a promise to not sell them off. But his obsession was political power. And like many other slave owning politicians, he was inattentive to his business as a planter. So he sold 36 people away to traders to cover his losses. Sale of slaves. I will sell at public auction on Monday, October 23rd at 4 p.m. at the auction room of David Dyer in Washington, D.C., the following slaves purchased by me upon the 22nd day of August last from Raisin Orme, and who were warranted sound in body and in mind, to wit, Dorcas Allen and her two surviving children, aged about 7 and 9 years, the other two having been killed by said Dorcas in a fit of insanity, as found by the jury who lately acquitted her. This is a woman who would rather see her children dead than see them enslaved. Terms of cash sale. As said slaves will be sold on account, said Raisin Orme, who refuses to retake the same and repay the purchase money, and who is notified to attend said sale, and if he thinks proper to bid for them or retake them as he prefers, upon refunding the money paid and all expenses incurred under the warranty given by him. James Birch, Edward Dyer, auctioneer. 4 years before John Quincy Adams delivered the winning argument in the well-known Amistad case, he went up against the District of Columbia slave trader James Birch with a less successful results. A diary entry of October 23rd, 1837 notes that there was in the National Intelligencer this morning an advertisement signed James H. Birch and Edward Dyer, auctioneer, headed Sale of Slaves. At a sale at public auction at 4 o'clock this afternoon of Dorcas Allen and her two surviving children, aged about 7 and 9 years, the other two having been unalived by said Dorcas in a fit of insanity, as found by the jury who lately acquitted her. The advertisement further says that the said slaves were purchased by Birch on the 22nd day of August last. I asked Mr. Fry what this advertisement meant. He seemed not to like to speak of it, but said the woman had been sold with her children to be sent to the South and separated from her husband, that she had unalived two of her children by slashing their throats, obliterating them, and cut her own to kill her to unalive herself. But in that she had failed, that she had been tried in Alexandria for the unaliving of her children and acquitted on the grounds of insanity, and that the sale was now by the purchaser at the expense of the seller upon the warranty that she was sound in body and mind. Adams visited the slave jail and spoke to Dyer, letting the traders know someone in Congress was watching. He said, I learned from Dyer that the woman had been the slave of a white woman who married a man named Davis who lived at Georgetown and was a clerk in the War Department. That this white woman had died and had before her death promised Dorcas her freedom. That on her deathbed she made her husband, Davis, promise her that he would emancipate Dorcas, that he did actually liberate her, but gave her no papers. That she lived 12 or 15 years at large, married, and had 4 children. That in the meantime, Davis married a second wife whose name was Maria, and afterwards he died without granting Dorcas her papers of freedom. That Davis's widow, Maria, married a man by the name of Rison Orme, and that he sold Dorcas and her 4 children on the 22nd day of August last for $700 to Birch, who is an agent for the Negro slave traders of Alexandria. That Dorcas and her 4 children were on the same day removed to one of the slave prisons in Alexandria. That in the night of that day, she obliterated her 2 youngest children, one a boy of 4 years of age, and the other a girl under 12 months. That she attempted to obliterate the other two, but was prevented, their screaming having roused some person in the house, who went to the cell where she was confined and took her surviving children away from her. That she was tried in Alexandria for murder of her 2 children and was acquitted by the jury on the ground of insanity. Adams discussed the case with District Attorney Francis Key Scott, who appeared to be interested himself in who appeared to be of interest in the case, Adams thought, in the plight of Allen's desperate free black husband, and proposed a fund to purchase her freedom, to which Adams contributed $50. But Adams wrote dejectedly on November 2nd, if their freedom from Birch's sale should be purchased, might they still be reclaimed by Davis's creditors? 8 days later, he wrote, upon conversing with Mr. Key, I found he would give no assurance that Dorcas Allen and her children will be free if they should be purchased from Birch. By the law of the place, they are assets in the estate of Gideon Davis, upon which there never has been any administration. Neither his widow nor her second husband had any right to sell them. You hear this? They didn't even have the right to sell these people because his property wasn't probated. But they were just doing stuff because they were financially in a bind or they were greedy. What ultimately happened is left a cliffhanger in Adam's diary. But Key doesn't seem to have come through for Dorcas Allen. By November 13th, she was with her husband and her two children back in Birch's jail. Mr. Key told me, Adams wrote, that if upon a writ of habeas corpus Birch's title could be disproved, still they were slaves. They could not be discharged. In his diary, Adams routinely referred to his Southern congressional opponents as the slavers, and to their Northern supporters as the serviles. On December 22nd, 1837, he recounted banter with Radcliffe Boone of Indiana, who recounts Adams said that if the question ever came to the issue of war, the Southern people would march into New England and conquer it. I said I had no doubt that they would if they could, and that it was they and that it was what they were now struggling with all their might. Land value bubble burst, but it was worse than that. In a feat of election year politicking, Congress passed and Jackson signed the Whig sponsored Deposits Act, which directed that most of the federal government's surplus achieved from approximately $35 million in land sales be distributed beginning in January 1837 to the states in proportion to their number of electoral votes, a formula proposed by Calhoun. Unfortunately for Mississippi, the state was only entitled to receive about $500,000 in the distribution, but its deposit banks had $10 million worth of revenues from land sales in that region, and therefore were going to have to send away 95% of their capital. Meanwhile, there had been an explosion of commercial banking in which new institutions were chartered as if broadcasting seed with no oversight. Florida banking operations of that time were satirized years later by Ellen Call Long, the daughter of Florida's governor during that era, former Jackson aide Richard K. Call, who had prosecuted the Seminole War, saying, "You want to know how it operates? Well, you see, a man can mortgage his land or his Negroes, draw from the bank 2/3 in money of their value, which can be reinvested in more land and more Negroes. One or two crops of cotton will redeem all obligation to the bank. So you see, that it is the best thing afloat. A man can just go to sleep and wake up rich. The riches obtained from this kind of maneuver, needless to say, were not in the form of gold pieces, but Negroes who remained as capital in the planter's possession when the cotton was sold, and who would always be used as collateral to collateralize a loan. After Jackson promoted the obliging Robert B. Taney to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he named Secretary of the Navy Levi Woodbury to be his fourth Secretary of the Treasury. As speculators bought public land with increasingly questionable behavior, Woodbury, on July 11, 1836, issued a document that snapped the overextended banking system, the Specie Circular, taking effect August 15th. It announced an abrupt shift to hard money on the part of the government, which would henceforth require payment for public lands in specie. The plan apparently was to remove all notes from circulation under $20, a little more than $500 in 2014 dollars, and replace them with coins with paper money being reserved for larger transactions. To make these coins, a series of new mints was built, including the U.S. Mint in New Orleans, one of the city's enduring landmarks. This move created a demand for coin that sucked specie reserves out of the eastern banks. As paper money spiraled toward worthlessness and banks suspended specie payments, silver and gold pieces were physically repositioned among the states. Biddle wrote in an unsigned piece in 1839 that the monetary affairs of the whole country were convulsed. Millions upon millions of coin were in transitu in every direction and consequently withdrawn from useful employment. Specie was going up and down the same river, to and from the north and south and the east and west at the same time. Millions were withdrawn from their usual and natural channels and forced against the current of trade. The term that was used to describe the westward movement of specie was the same used for the westward movement of the Native Americans, removal. The Specie Circular was not the only thing that brought down the American economy, but it was Jackson's crowning achievement to that end. As Jackson was preparing to leave office, still riding a national wave of adulation, he warned, according to his biographer Parton, that a paper money system and its natural associates, monopoly and exclusive privileges, have already struck their roots deep in the soil, and it will require all your efforts to check its further growth and to eradicate this evil. Paper money was evil. No moral relativism, evil. Only gold and silver were good. Fast growing New Orleans had broken into three pieces: the French speakers in the downtown French Quarter and the uptown Anglophone businessmen had long been loggerheads physically separated by Canal Street, which was a filthy, muddy no man's land, or as they saw in New Orleans, neutral ground. Though immigrants generally did not come to the South, they did come to New Orleans, the second largest destination for them was after New York City. They encountered a vicious nativist movement. One New Orleans paper was called The True American. The uptown Anglo Americans in fast growing New Orleans, in effect, seceded from the city, though historians have generally refrained from using that term when speaking about it. But they seceded from the city on March 8th, 1836, separating themselves off from their French speaking counterparts, whom they saw as receiving an excessive share of the public purse. The city split into three municipalities, each in charge of its own revenues. The first municipality, French speaking and Catholic, was the old town below Canal Street, the French Quarter. The second, English speaking and Protestant, was at Faubourg St. Mary, uptown above Canal Street, which is today's central business district. The third, French speaking and Catholic, and unpaved and unlighted, so low class, was the Faubourg Marigny, downriver from the first and below Esplanade. These municipalities, which were more or less antagonistic, each had their own police force, complete with hostilities between the respective departments whose primary duty was slave patrol. Each municipality built its own levees and administered its own infrastructure. The Anglo Americans of the second municipality intended to corner railroad commerce. A proposed railroad, the New Orleans and Nashville planned to link the major trade terminus of Tennessee and Carrollton, a suburb of New Orleans, named for railroad hero Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who had died in 1832 at the age of 95. So in 1832, white people were living to 95 years of age if they took care of themselves. So don't let them fool you by making you think that you have to work until you die, because we've been living a long time. White people have been living a long time for a long time, and Black people have been living even longer for a longer period of time. There is very little doubt hummed in an 1835 editorial in the New Orleans Bee of the New Orleans and Nashville Railroad being completed in 3 or 4 years. The local spur line to Carrollton was built entirely within the Anglo controlled part of town. In seceding from New Orleans, the Anglo American second municipality made off with that new railroad link, which began operations on September 22nd, 1835. But the Nashville Railroad was never built. The only part ever completed was the local link from present day Lee Circle to Carrollton. Though it never became a freight corridor connected to a mighty railroad, the link became instead the anchor of uptown New Orleans development, carrying passengers. It even had a ladies' car. It made the far-flung Carrollton Hotel a chic place for downtowners to repair to for supper, and encouraged the development of the territory in between. The space between New Orleans and Carrollton filled in alongside the train, whose track became an extension of the former stub street of St. Charles. The rail line became public transportation through what became known as the Garden District, and is today the main streetcar line that connects downtown and uptown. The New Orleans streetcar line was thus approximately tied with New York, the Long Island Railroad, as the first in the U.S. to connect city with suburb by rail. But the failure to connect to the national rail network betokened the beginning of New Orleans' long decline. Meanwhile, the breakup of the city left the English speakers without the year's biggest fun. Mardi Gras was a French thing done at the done at that time in New Orleans, more or less on the Parisian model. The pre-Lenten carnival season was celebrated with masked balls galore in the French Quarter, the masks being the main difference between carnival balls and the year-round schedule of dances. The first organized Mardi Gras parade that we know of in New Orleans took place in 1837, less than a month before the inauguration in Washington, D.C. of President Martin Van Buren, which was only 6 weeks before the New Orleans True American published its sensational reportage on the failure of Herman Briggs and Company. Headed by America's most famous war hero, with Martin Van Buren, Amos Kendall, James K. Polk, Sam Houston, John Tyler, James Buchanan, and the young Franklin Pierce, Taney and Woodward on the Supreme Court, and Francis Scott Key as the capital's district attorney, the Jackson dynasty was the most powerful political force the United States had ever seen. Van Buren's election was to be its consolidation. Matty Van, or the Little Magician, for his short stature and political cunning, was the red fox for his hair, OK, or Old Kinderhook, for his New York hometown, or the wily Dutchman of the Albany Regency, as one of Polk's correspondents unflatteringly put it, was the first president born after independence, the first presidential candidate to campaign openly, and the first professional politician to become president. But the chickens came home to roost on his head. 6 weeks after Van Buren was inaugurated on March 4th, 1837, his one-term presidency was wrecked by economic convulsions as banks began suspending specie payments. The winds of global trade had shifted again. The British financiers most heavily exposed to the American debtors were insolvent. The Bank of England, which had its own problems, constricted credit. The invention of the telegraph was still 7 years away, and steamships did not yet ply the Atlantic. The Panic of 1837 was in part a crisis of slow-moving financial information. The panic seems to have begun in New Orleans when the cotton factorage firm Herman Briggs and Company failed, perhaps because its proprietor, Louis Florian Herman, was a German Jew. The New Orleans True American printed a sensational story about it that traveled far and wide, spreading worry. Then JS&L, Joseph and Company, a New York firm that was Herman Briggs' creditor, failed too. Meanwhile, the price of cotton plunged in Liverpool to a staggering 50% of what the cotton brokers had extended to the planters, writes Jessica Lepler. There was not yet class solidarity among bankers, so the deposits and directors of New Orleans' 16 banks did not take concerted action, or even apparently talk to each other as the crisis accelerated. They all suspended specie payments in April. Then the failure spread to New York on May 8th. The 1840 census showed New Orleans as the nation's third largest city with 102,193 residents, effectively tied with Baltimore's 102,313 residents for second place. New Orleans, the number one port in the United States, was unlike the rest of the South in many ways. It was urban, it had a substantial business community, and a local economy dominated by factors: a waterfront that shipped the world's greatest quantities of cotton and much sugar, and since the plantations of Louisiana and Mississippi required enormous amounts of credit, it had a large banking sector, heavily capitalized by captive human beings. But though the port's overall receipts continued to grow, the panic was the end of New Orleans' peak period of national influence, and its share of the nation's expanding commerce grew progressively smaller. In particular, New Orleans failed to get in on the rail transport business, the competition from which was cutting into the river trade more and more every year. The Mississippi River had formerly been the only way for a wide swath of the United States to get its goods to market. But as railroads slowly extended their reach, slowly because laying a railroad was a big operation that required solid financing, the rivers would matter less. New Orleans continued growing, but it would never again be tied for the second largest city in the United States. New Orleans was, however, the largest slave market in the United States. At least half, if not more, of its sales and probably most of its high value deals were conducted by private sale out of dealer showrooms. Some of the buildings are still there, though the spectacular main auction venues are long gone. Some dealers made slaves stand out on the sidewalk from 9 to 4, trying to entice buyers. The horrors of slave auctioning have been amply detailed elsewhere, and we will not describe these wrenching scenes here, citing merely one example: the testimony of the formerly enslaved Stephen Jordan many years after he was sold in New Orleans, where he said, "I tell you, people were miserable in that old slave pen. They used to make them open their mouths so that they could examine their teeth, and they used to strip them naked from head to foot so that they could see whether they were perfectly sound. And this they did to women as well as men. I tell you, my dear child, I used to seem it used to seem to me so brutal to see poor women treated in the way that brutal and heartless men by brutal and heartless men. I declare, child, I can't understand it, although I've been right in it. When they would put them naked that way, they used to switch them on the legs to make them jump around so that the buyers could see how supple they were." Again, this is just one example of a slave market, but they will try to propagandize you and tell you that the auction block was a humane place. There was nothing humane about the auction block. Dealers generally got better prices at private sale than at auction, but now, but not necessarily. Auctions in New Orleans, typically conducted bilingually in French and English, were conducted to turn over large numbers of people as quickly as possible. It was a fast way to get rid of less desirable slaves, or, on the other end of the profit scale, to maximize the value of white looking beauty or first rate cabinet makers. The New Orleans market sent large numbers of young men to the sugar plantations, which they always wanted fresh victims. So the gender ratio of people sold in New Orleans skewed disproportionately toward males. But with so many wealthy people in the city, New Orleans also served the nation's largest market for domestic servants and skilled artisans. And it was the number one retail market for fancy girls, with either Natchez or the horse racing and gambling center of Lexington, Kentucky, perhaps a distant second in this category. With so much money flowing through the town, it was a great moment for the architecture, not all of which survives. The St. Louis Hotel, which ran the length of the block from Royal to Chartres on St. Louis Street, is long gone. Frederick Bancroft visited its abandoned shell in 1902 and wrote of the blaze of light from the dome that still illuminated the floor where slaves were sold daily. With its front entrance on St. Louis Street, the British visitor J.S. Buckingham described it in 1839, saying, "The entrance into the exchange at the St. Louis is through a handsome vestibule, a hall of about 127 feet by 40, which leads to the rotunda. This is crowned by a beautiful and lofty dome with a finely ornamented ceiling in the interior and a variegated marble pavement. In the rotunda, pictures are exhibited and auctions are held for every description of good. At the time of our visit, there were half a dozen auctioneers, each endeavoring to drown every voice out but his own, and all straining their lungs and distorting their countenances to hide into a hideous manner. One was selling pictures and dwelling on their merits. Another was disposing of ground lots of embryo cities and expatiating on their capacities. Another was disposing of some slaves. These consisted of an unhappy Negro family who were all exposed to the hammer at the same time. Their good qualities were enumerated in English and in French, and their persons were carefully examined by intending purchasers, among whom they were ultimately disposed of chiefly to Creole buyers. The husband, $750. The wife at $550. The two children at $220 each. The middle of the rotunda was filled with casks, boxes, bales, and crates, and the Negroes exposed for sale were put to stand on these to be better seen by a person attending the sale. Often as I have witnessed this painful scene in the times of old in the West Indies and in several of the countries of the East, it has lost none of its pain by repetition. It appeared indeed more revolting here, in contrast with the Republican institutions in America. The St. Louis was far from the only auction venue, Banks Arcade, an enormous building that ran from Gravier to Natchez Street on Magazine, hosted them. A small part of the Banks Arcade still stands, as do a number of now repurposed former slave dealer showrooms in New Orleans. It was at Banks on October 15th, 1835, that a meeting of the Friends of Texas promised financial and military support to the Anglo American Provisional Government in Texas, in blatant violation of U.S. neutrality laws. Mexico, after its independence in 1821, prohibited slavery, but the territory was only sparsely settled. Hoping to populate it, the Mexican government invited in settlers from the United States, giving them land. But once the settlers moved in, they declared it theirs. Moses Austin, who had become one of the country's major producers of lead, was a major promoter of the Texas colonization movement. With his eyes on Mexico's lead mines, Austin had sworn allegiance to the Spanish crown in 1798. His son, the Virginia born, Missouri raised land speculator Stephen F. Austin, brought slavery to Texas, and he fought to keep it. It was an article of faith throughout the South and American slavery that the South it was an article of faith throughout the South that American slavery must be expanded into Texas and beyond. There was no question that Texas would be the ultimate destination for young Africans who were being born and raised all over the Cotton Kingdom. Stephen Austin wrote his sister Emily from New Orleans in August of 1835. You know, the summer of the Southern abolition panic. It is very evident that that Texas should be effectually and fully Americanized. Texas must be slave country. It is no longer a matter of doubt. The interest of Louisiana requires that it should be. A population of fanatical abolitionists in Texas would have the very dangerous and pernicious influence on the overgrown slave population of Louisiana. Andrew Jackson mentioned Sam Houston, the Scotch, Irish descended, Virginia born, Tennessee raised land speculator, politician, and military leader. Houston had served under Jackson in the Creek War and had been the Jacksonian governor of Tennessee before fleeing to Texas to escape a disastrous marriage. He was one of 59 signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence on March 2nd, 1836. For days before the massacre at the Alamo, as a general in the Texas Army, he was the hero of the decisive Battle of San Jacinto that took Mexican General Antonio Lopez of the Santa Anna prisoner. On October 22nd, Jackson's protege became the first president of the Republic of Texas. There was much opposition in the North to annexing Texas because it meant expansion of U.S. slavery. With Jackson, with Jackson's anointed successor, Van Buren, fighting hard to be elected president, annexation was too politically controversial and would provoke a sectional controversy instead of strengthening the national party the Democrats had built. James Hamilton of South Carolina printed a report in the Telegraph, which was a Jacksonian organ that presented the Texans as a people struggling for their liberty and therefore entitled to our sympathy. As John Quincy Adams disgustedly wrote in his diary, he continued, "The fact is directly the reverse. They are fighting for the establishment and perpetuation of slavery, and that is the cause of the South Carolinian sympathy with them. But for all this involvement in the Texas Project, Jackson didn't annex the territory. Instead, one of his last acts as president was to recognize the independent Republic of Texas. Houston rendered an annexation offer, but John Quincy Adams stalled the annexation of Texas in Congress. Houston took it off the table in 1839, with the result that Texas and the United States dealt with each other for about 10 years as independent nations. Meanwhile, two real estate speculators from New York who intended to develop a new town obtained permission to use Sam Houston's name. Incorporated on June 5th, 1837, the town of Houston, a city named for the sitting president, served as the capital of the Republic of Texas until the capital was moved to Austin in 1839. That year, the Texas Congress adopted the Lone Star banner representing the territory's readiness to go it alone as the national flag. It subsequently became and remains the state flag of Texas. So that big star you see on flags have a history behind them. And that history is that they were willing to they were willing to separate themselves from the United States of America and become their own sovereign nation in order to upkeep slavery. It all sounds impressive. The Mississippi and Alabama Railroad Company, more familiarly known as the Brandon Bank. It was chartered in Brandon, Mississippi in 1836, supposedly to build a railroad, but it never even tried. In 1837, with most of the state's plantation land already mortgaged, the Brandon Bank began making cash advances on cotton crops, paying 12 cents per pound expected. Unfortunately, by July of 1838, the price for cotton was down to 8/3 of a cent, 0.083 cents a pound. And moreover, many farmers delivered no cotton to the bank at all. By the fall that year, the bank's money was circulating in Jackson at 30 to 40% off of its face value. The sell off of the public lands continued. John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary in June of 1838 that the thirst of a trigger for blood is the fittest emblem for the rapacity with which the members of Congress of all the new states fly at the public lands. The constituents upon whom they are dependent all are settlers or tame and careless speculators of the pillage. They are themselves enormous speculators and land jobbers. The nation's economy seemed to recover in 1838 as banks warily warmed and resumed specie payments, but it didn't last. The United States government was broke and couldn't make the final payment on the redistribution of the long gone surplus. Three Mississippi bank commissioners traveled to Philadelphia, where they sold Nicholas Biddle $5 million in U.S. Mississippi bonds. Biddle sent the bonds on to London, where the United States Bank's London agency sold 2 million of them to European investors and transferred the remaining 3 million to London and Amsterdam bankers as collateral security. They wound up in the hands of the Rothschilds, the Baring brothers, and others who knew quite well that they were purchasing shares in slaves. James T. McIntosh writes that when the specie resulting from the sale of the bonds finally reached Mississippi, people celebrated in the belief that their financial woes were at an end. Edwin Arthur Miles writes that the entire population regarded those 5 millions as an especially godsend. Wagon after wagon was seen conveying a portion of those 5 million in hard dollars to the vaults of the bank. With that money in hand, loans were made supporting cotton production, which was to say, purchasing the bodies of young African Americans trafficked from more settled regions of the country. Several other states also indebted themselves wildly in the British and other capital markets. In a very short period, writes Alasdair Roberts, American states accumulated obligations roughly equal to the combined national debt of Russia, Prussia, and the Netherlands. Then, prompted by a bad wheat harvest in England that made Britain a food importer, the price of cotton in Liverpool crashed again in April of 1839. Prices of slaves, so fundamental to the Southern economy, took a precipitous tumble. The only major slide in the dollar value of slaves during the antebellum decades. As mortgages crashed and liquidation sales put thousands of enslaved laborers for sale in depressed market, the interstate slave trade slowed down. In Mississippi, the Union Bank lasted less than 2 years from its creation before its charter was withdrawn by Governor Alexander G. McNutt on July 10, 1840. By 1841, both of the Mississippi state banks had suspended interest payments on their $7 million worth of bonds. 8 states defaulted on their bonds, plus the territory of Florida. All but Mississippi and Florida eventually resumed payment on at least some of them, although Louisiana, Arkansas, and Michigan repudiated part of them. The Republic of Texas, which had no extradition treaty with the United States, quickly became a notorious haven for busted farmers escaping their debts. GTT, gone to Texas, and for deadbeats and crooks of all sorts. Texas had no money to speak of, but when Texans did have money, often meaning when they could borrow it, they tended to spend it on slaves. Sam Houston wrote General William G. Harding of Nashville on July 17, 1841, trying to explain why he hadn't paid back a $500 loan yet, saying, I have offered every sacrifice in property, but there is no money in Texas, but our depreciated notes. I have upward of $25,000 due me, and some of it for years, and I cannot collect as much as will pay 1/4 of my land tax. In addition, 2 valuable Negro boys, for which I had paid cash $2,100 previous to my visit in Nashville, ran away last spring to Mexico. Thus, you see, I am in bad luck. The state of Mississippi's answer was simple. Rather than impose a tax to pay its obligations, it flat out stiffed its creditors, alleging legal technicalities. Governor McNutt proposed debt repudiation to the legislature on January 5th, 1841. It was blatant theft based on a bogus, legalistic argument, and it became a divisive campaign issue in the subsequent state elections. The pro repudiation forces won and passed a congressional amendment that forbade the repaying of the bonds, occasioning litigation that dragged on into the 20th century. The default ruined the name of Mississippi in Europe and even affected the ability of the U.S. government to borrow money there, although the federal government had a clean credit record. Bill collectors prowled Mississippi. When England threatened to invade the state on behalf of its burned creditors, John Quincy Adams moved on March 2nd, 1843, that any state that found itself at war as a result of repudiating its debts will cease thereby to be a state of this union and will have no right to aid in her defense from the United States or any one of them. When the Southern states ceded, not 20 years later, repudiating their debts in the process, British financiers were not eager to lend money. So, as you can see, waking up rich had its consequences. Waking up rich meant interesting things to different people. You could go to sleep with a few seeds of cotton, a couple of slaves, and just wake up rich one day because the price of cotton in England was selling so high. But you subjected yourself to the volatility of the English market. And when you didn't pay those New Englanders, they were angry and they wanted their money back. All right, we're going to end it right there. I will be back next Tuesday reading The American Slave Coast. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here. I know that the forecast is listening, MG2 is listening, KW97 is listening, Bawana Haguziki is listening, Raw and the elders that listen with her are listening, and so many others. And even you, yes, you, dear listener, I appreciate you lending me your ears for this time. I value each and every one of you. I thank each and every one of you for your support, whether it's a like or a share or something financial or a subscription. I appreciate you. Thanks for tuning in. Oh, thank you, Cultured Education. I appreciate you. I will talk to you soon. Peace, guys.